Hi, this is Susan Kokinda with LaRouche PAC with the second of two interviews with Brian Lance of LaRouche PAC's economics team. In our first discussion, we looked at the vast amount of skilled labor and capital goods producing capacity that we have both in the military itself and in the defense industrial base. We have between 1.2 million and 1.5 million skilled workers deployed in aeronautics and defense. The Defense Department itself is the biggest employer in the world. Many of the people enlisted in our military have skilled training in things like mechanics, transportation, engineering, and healthcare. Now, whether that capacity is being deployed effectively or misdeployed is not the topic of our discussion today. What we're going to talk about today is the potential to use that critical element, the critical elements of that capacity as the seed crystal for reviving and rebuilding our industrial and manufacturing base, which is in very great need of being revived. Now, one of the things about the defense industrial process is that it reflects a special kind of relationship between the federal government and the private sector. The federal government defines the mission. The private sector responds and executes. And that kind of partnership is a reflection of what used to be known as the American system, or what we call Hamiltonian economics, something which Lyndon LaRouche wrote and spoke of extensively. So let's start out with a discussion of a few times in our more recent history when this kind of partnership functioned in a very necessary way. Obviously, the war mobilization for World War II, which made Michigan, where I'm sitting right now, the arsenal of democracy, is one such example. So, Brian, welcome, and give us a picture of how this has worked before.
Yeah, sure. Good to be back. Yeah, the defense sector, you're in the United States, you're talking about 5 million employees. That's not including National Guardsmen and so forth. And actually, the aerospace defense sector is 2.1 or 2.2 million employed either with the major contractors or subcontractors. 1.2 million of that is subcontractors, with a lot of flexibility there for utilization in all kinds of ways. If we go then back to the period of World War II, we were talking about mobilizing a labor force, which only, a matter of years earlier had been unemployed largely, had begun to be brought back into the workforce, including through the CCC program and so on and so forth, but still was a shadow of its former self. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which started that rebuilding process before the war, greatly expanded. And that process really started with Jesse Jones, who came from Houston, Texas, where I'm at today. And he joined up with William Knudsen from up there in Michigan with Ford, and then General Motors, the head of General Motors. And they went to work in Washington, D.C., heading up the war mobilization effort. And we'll come back to some of the organizational aspects of that. But that effort, first of all, transformed our infrastructure. It created an aluminum industry, steel industry, machine tools, which I think we're going to be talking about some. Machine tools, the equivalent of what today would be something on the order of $40 billion was expended by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and one of its subsidiaries, the Defense Production Board, to essentially finance machine tool construction, to build entirely new plants, and to finance existing companies that were building machine tools to provide them the capital. They advanced the money for contracts to build out the machine tool capability, because obviously, as you know, without machine tools, you can't build anything. And if you're going to build airplanes and tanks and ammunition and so on, in a modern economy at that day, this required a whole new set of machine tools. And those, they had to be designed, they had to be built. And so the machine tool sector is really a key element of what was done with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But this was a collaborative effort.
Yeah, I know Knudsen said that the person he worked most closely with was Jesse Jones from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is something of an irony since it was the Roosevelt New Deal and a hardcore industrial capitalist. But it really reflected what happens when you bring this question of a national mission together with the entrepreneurial ingenuity of your population. On the machine tool question, which we will get back to, Knudsen would always have to respond to Congress. They would say, well, we gave you all the money. How come we haven't seen anything produced yet? And he would say, because it takes a year to tool up to even begin. And the fact that we have that capacity, at least somewhat sequestered in our defense industrial base at this point, is extremely important. And we will get back to that. One of the other, I think, even more recent examples, and perhaps a happier example because it didn't involve having to go to war, which obviously was necessary at the time of World War II. But one of the happier examples, of course, is the Apollo space program. Again, government mission, private sector implementation of it. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, Jesse Jones, an industrialist from Texas, said that Knudsen had probably done more to win the war than any other American. So that's Knudsen, William Knudsen. NASA, the space program, it really, these are partnership efforts. With the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Knudsen, Jesse Jones, they brought in the CEOs of the major corporations, labor, the Commerce Department, you name it. They were brought in, and these sessions cracked the nut. How are we going to mobilize? What are the priorities? What are what we now would call supply chains? How are they going to be built out in the rest? NASA was similar. People forget or weren't around at the time, but when NASA, when we launched with Mercury and then later Gemini and then Apollo programs, we were really just coming out of the war, out of the Korean War at that point. The aerospace industry was a shadow of what it is today, or it was at the height of its development. And so here was this question of combining through contracting, a contracting partnership between the private sector and the government, the construction of entirely new, shall we call them vehicles? I mean, rockets, you're going to lift people to the moon. And through those programs, this required just a continued collaboration because you couldn't even apply directly aerospace technology of that time to this new task. New kinds of welding to sustain the vibrations of a rocket engine taking off. On and on. This was just enormously complex. And so you had day-to-day meetings, not only at NASA headquarters, but up and down the production lines, at the Corbett headquarters in Washington, D.C. I mean, this was a continual process, back and forth, up and down the lines. How do we solve that? And I remember last week you used an example of a friend of yours who was machining a part for NASA, and the NASA employee contract was standing right there waiting to receive that component and fly it back to Florida or Houston, wherever it needed to go. So this is the kind of partnership effort that was required, and it was problem solving. And that's what's going to be required today to build out the US economy. As we've discussed last week, the national security of the United States depends now on rebuilding the entire US economy as a productive economy, as a manufacturing superpower, as President Trump has said. And that's going to require this kind of collaboration, not just a industrial policy, but an actual full-blown Hamiltonian American system program.
Well, you sort of speculated on what kind of process or combinations you could put together similar to what we saw in World War II and with NASA in terms of pulling the critical elements of these sectors together around a mission to rebuild. Can you give us some ideas of how you think that would look? I know one of the critical aspects to this, which is really quite stunning, is the number of small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, when we think of defense, we think of Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and so on. But the guts of it, really, I think, is
Yes.
the hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises. So how would you see actually pulling together a kind of mission-oriented organization to do this?
Yeah, well, the production planning board, initiated by Knudsen, is a good example, where you essentially say, okay, we're calling in everybody. This is under the direction of the president. This should be under the direction of President Trump, a new Trump administration. This is called together, not a one-shot meeting. This will be a continued ongoing process, lots of Zoom calls, Skype calls, whatever, as well, fleshing this out. But sure, you want to bring in the Commerce Department, you've got the Department of Energy, as well as the Department of Defense. The SISME, or SESME, is a network of small and medium sized manufacturers nationally. They have developed as essentially kind of affinity groups in various parts of the country. You want to bring in SESME. You want to bring in Puget Sound in the Northwest, where a lot of Boeing capability still exists. You have CAMPS, which is short for the Center for Advanced Manufacturing in Puget Sound, CAMPS, and it's small and medium-sized enterprises. It's their organization. So you want to bring them directly into the process. And you can imagine this idea of affinity groups may sound a little strange, but if you're gonna have to do a lot of problem solving and you're gonna want to involve these people right on down the production process, the components and everything that are going into what we need to build out as a new infrastructure for the nation. So these infinity groups, affinity could become an infinity of potential. So I think that, this is, you could get into a lot. There's Manufacturing USA. There's a lot of other organizations that exist. There's the aeronautics agencies of the companies that are producing aerospace and defense product now. Obviously, they'd be brought in. So then within each company, particularly the majors, you'd want to create, I think, committees within the company and say, okay, here you guys, you're named to this committee. Your job is to come up with how we retool. What could we contribute to the retooling of the industrial base of the United States? What could we do for desalinization plants? What could we do for factory-built small modular nuclear reactors? Or what could we do in some other area of the economy for NWAPA or other projects? To brainstorm on this, not just in isolation, but obviously tap the people around you and tap those small and medium-sized enterprises that are your subcontractors, your associates. So this is the kind of process that would be required. And it would be very open to the public. It was the case with NASA, the contracts, the bidding, who got the contracts. This was a big deal for cities, towns, states, and was very much done in the public eye. They talked about it as being a fishbowl. In fact, if you were working for NASA and the space program, you were in the fishbowl in the public eye. And we would want the same process going forward here in this case. I mean, just think if Twitter, was full of discussion of, well, what do we need What do we need in terms of inland desalination processes? What's the leading edge in terms of laser technology that can be applied to the most advanced forms of machine tooling, or all kinds of other areas where you would get this kind of dialogue going and discussion in the public. This would completely transform the country, I think.
Absolutely. And it also it gets out of the bugaboo of, this eternal tension about, government bad or good, industry bad or good. It's either one or it's the other, but rather this question of a shared mission, and providing number one, a national mission, which only your national government can do. Number two, providing the credit, as you mentioned, with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or today perhaps with the national bank, which is sorely needed. But then the individual creativity and entrepreneurship flourishes within that kind of environment. And that is what has been sorely lacking in most of the recent period, as we've watched our economy decline and decline and decline, as Donald Trump keeps mentioning. One other aspect I want to focus on, because we've talked about it a couple of times, is the machine tool sector. Lyndon LaRouche often wrote and spoke about what he called the machine tool principle, and the indispensable role that it plays in driving constant advances in an economy.
Yes.
So, when somebody makes a technological or a scientific breakthrough, that breakthrough has to be transmitted into the productive process by skilled workers who transform those ideas into machine tools that can then make the machines. So as we discussed in our first interview, the defense industrial base has managed to do something that almost no other sector has done, and that is not outsource most of the machine tool capability. Which I think is extremely important. It means we have stuff right here in terms of the baseline of what you need to rebuild an economy. You do have a level of machine tool capacity still here in the United States. Now, I think President Trump recognized the significance of this, and there's a group that came into existence, I believe, during President Trump's administration, and it still exists, called America's Cutting Edge.
ACE.
ACE. So this I think is another precious resource. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, it was brought into being by executive order by the President of the United States, President Trump. It was Executive Order 13806. And that resulted in a study of the state, up-to-date study of the defense industrial complex. We talked about some of that last week. And then one of the outcomes in 2017 was the creation of ACE as a collaboration between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of our major national laboratories, the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and part of Manufacturing USA, which is called the Institute for Advanced Composites Manufacturing Innovation, long name, but it brought them together. They created a test bed project in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm sorry, in Knoxville, Tennessee. This program had several different aspects of it. One was that it created teams in conjunction with a private company, MSC Industrial, which is this is one of the largest suppliers to machine shops and so forth around the country that exists. They handle the sale of over 1 million different items, 1.5 million items. But they also supply men and women who know this equipment and go out and help train individuals in the use of this equipment in machine shops, as machine shops upgrade. Well, anyway, so they were incorporated in this to do a survey and upgrade of machine shops around the United States as part of ACE, as part of the ACE program. But then alongside of that has been the development of training programs. That's now expanded. There's now, there's one in North Carolina now. There's a partnership now between Texas A&M University here in Texas with the Marshall University up in West Virginia. They've set up machine shop training programs, on the cutting edge to train up additional machinists and eventually tool and die and so forth. These people can go on to higher positions, more advanced positions. But the point is, it's a collaborative effort, as you're saying, to spark a process of rebuilding of the U.S. machine tool sector. There's 30,000 machine shops across the United States. They're in all kinds of conditions and often work under very difficult conditions. Not the man on the shop floor, but the ability to keep these companies afloat. You may have a contract today with the Department of Defense, you may not tomorrow, or with one of the big 6 aerospace firms or whatever, right? So the market has narrowed for these machine shops to the defense sector, aerospace defense, but particularly the defense sector. Well, okay, if you're now we've got to take ACE and we got to use that as a kind of model, Trump's example in this case, and expand that out to national efforts. And again, this is where these men and women in the aerospace defense sector, in the U.S. military itself, these highly trained individuals in the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, Coast Guard themselves, trained as machinists, trained as mechanics, and so forth, have a very, very important roles to play. These can be additional shop teachers. These can be, they can multiply the number of men and women we have as productive employees in our manufacturing industrial base.
Well, this is really a tremendous potential, and obviously it needs to have a mission, which we certainly don't have under the current administration.
And we can't build it all at once. We're going to have to prioritize energy, water. Go ahead. I just want to.
Well, no, we're gonna have to prioritize given how much damage has been done over the course of the last 2+ years. And obviously, as I say, it is going to take a national mission. Do you want to just briefly, in closing, address some of the frontier areas like fusion, the space program, advanced nuclear policies that would absorb or could be accelerated by the deployment of these kinds of capabilities?
Well, I reemphasize again that we're going to need just to build out the U.S. manufacturing sector, which is, it's roughly 8 or 9% of employment is in manufacturing now. 1 in 12 jobs. It used to be 1 in 3. To rebuild that manufacturing capacity, we're going to need 200 gigawatts. That's 200 nuclear power plants just to produce the energy required to drive those productive manufacturing outlets, factories, to employ these people productively. So we can produce here what we're now importing from abroad and can't pay for. But multiply that by the growth of the population, which is another 100 million plus between now and 2050. Multiply that by the shortfall. We know brownouts and blackouts. We need 800 to 1,000 gigawatts of nuclear power brought online over the course of the next couple of decades. So that entails supply chains. That entails components. The AP1000s of Westinghouse can be built modularly, so we can build them components in factories. But that has to be built out. It's just like a wartime mobilization effort. Small modular reactors. Then we get to desalinization. This is, the drought on the West Coast is not over, but we need more security in our water supply systems whether you're talking about transportation in terms of locks and so forth, or you're talking about desal capacity. So we don't run out of water and never run out of water, because industrial processes, if we're going to build that out, that requires a multiplier of water, fresh water, to be available. The workforce, the Space CCC proposal that we've advanced, that I've advanced, to create a modern day CCC equivalent, to take young men and women out of, basically off the streets and train them up into productive positions. This is the ACE program is in microcosm doing some of that. They're working with ex-drug addicts. They're working with people with, rarely homeless individuals and so forth, and training them up and getting results. So these are some of the aspects, priority aspects. The rail system, we've just had these recent disasters, one of the most recent in Palestine, Ohio. These are avoidable. We need higher standards. That's a whole nother subject, but we've got to build out a modern high-speed rail system. High speed, much less maglev for freight. We've got to have high speed. And moving a lot more capacity around the country. If you're going to double and triple manufacturing, think of the requirements in terms of transport. So those are practical examples. And then you go to fusion, which is the next breakthrough in energy, to multiply by an order of magnitude energy available. That's whole new materials, science. This is all kinds of areas of breakthroughs that are going to be required both on science, but then on the production, the scaling up process, the retooling process, once again, and space. Project Artemis, as you know, it's got to be done sooner rather than later. We've got to go to the moon and Mars and beyond to find out, discover the new physical principles that will drive the new breakthroughs that will produce the new prototypes for those new machine tools that we haven't even dreamed of yet. So I hope that encapsulates.
Well, it both gives the mission and the vision, and the fact that we're not starting from what seemed like absolute zero, given the decrepit state of our economy. The fact that there is sequestered in the economy a certain capability to begin to jumpstart this kind of process, all the while being able to maintain whatever military preparedness and defense we actually need, perhaps not shooting Stinger missiles at balloons or sending tens of billions of dollars. Yeah, or sending tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Obviously, we have to maintain our own defense capability, but the opportunity to take what we have at least preserved in this sector and use it, as we've said, to jumpstart an industrial renaissance is very, very hopeful. So thank you, Brian. I think this is revelatory for a lot of people, and we will definitely continue the discussion.
Good to be back.